this so much because it breaks my heart, the pathetic idiocy we see from economists so much. But the truth is, they're rich, they're from rich families, they're from rich backgrounds, they're getting paid, they don't give a shit, right? Okay, so this is going to be the final video in the series about the 700 billion. It's going to cover how it ended up with the rich and how that affects the economy. Okay, so we've been doing a lot of videos on this 700 billion recently. I think it's a really useful way to criticize the government and also to understand what's happened in the economy. The last video we did explains exactly what the 700 billion was. It's the total government deficit since the beginning of COVID, which is the total amount of money, essentially, the government has given out above and beyond taxes. So when the government taxes, it moves around, but when it gives extra out, that creates more money in society. And someone ends up with more money. 700 billion pounds, massive, massive amount of money, 14,000 pounds for everyone, every single adult in the country. It was always going to have massive economic effects. Now, a big part of the argument of this channel is that that money has largely ended up with the richest. In fact, the reason why we made this channel is because right at the beginning of COVID, it was pretty clear to me that 250 billion pounds, which is how much it was then, was going to end up with the richest people in the country. It was going to transform inequality. It was going to have massive implications for ordinary people. So that's why we made this channel, and we made the very first video on this channel. So the very first video on this channel basically explains exactly that, how that money ended up with the richest. I'm not going to go through a completely detailed explanation. If you want that, then go and watch that video. We'll put a link in the description. We'll put a little pop-up maybe for it, so you can see that video. But I'm going to describe very, very succinctly how that money ended up with the richest people in society. So since we know that 700 billion pounds was given out, we must also know that somebody has it. Because it's so much, 14,000 pounds per adult, it raises quite a big question as to who, because I suspect that the vast majority of people watching will not have accumulated 14,000 pounds cash in the last 3 years. In fact, most people will find themselves poorer now than they were 3 years ago. So it's a big question, right? Who has the money? And it was a question that was puzzling me at the beginning of COVID, because at the beginning of COVID, I think the narrative was this money is going to furloughed workers. But if you look at furloughed workers, they didn't get richer, right? So 250 billion, which is what it was then, that's 5,000 pounds per adult in the country. You know, for every furloughed worker, it's something like 50,000 pounds, right? Because not everybody was furloughed, or maybe something like 40,000 pounds. You know, of course, every furloughed worker is not accumulating 40,000 pounds. Remember, the question here is not who gets the money initially, it's who ends up accumulating the money. You know, we're pouring 250 billion, or we're pouring 700 billion in. It's going to swim around and it's going to end up with some people. Who ends up with that 700 billion, right? And it was a bit of a mystery to me at the beginning of COVID, right? Because the narrative was all it's the furloughed workers, but the furloughed workers weren't accumulating anything. In fact, they were getting poorer because they're getting less. So it raises the question of who actually ends up with the money. And all you need to do is follow the money through the system, right? So furloughed workers, they get extra money from the government, but they don't get richer because they don't get their wages anymore. Okay, so who's got the wages? Well, it's companies that pay the wages. So, but are companies getting richer? Well, actually, the companies who furloughed their workers during COVID generally got poorer during COVID because they were shut down. They weren't getting their income. Okay, so who gets the income that normally goes to the companies that then gets paid to the workers? Well, that's customers. And actually, this is where the money accumulates, because customers massively cut their spending during COVID. But crucially, not all customers, right? If you're an ordinary family, or especially if you're a poor family, almost all of your expenses is essentials: rent, mortgage, food, bills. These payments did not decrease during COVID. But what payments did decrease during COVID? The answer is non-essential or luxury payments. Holidays, bars, restaurants, all of the things that were shut down, basically. Theatre, this kind of thing. And who has the highest spending on those luxuries? Well, it's basically a perfect proxy for how rich you are. So what happened during COVID and during lockdown was that the spending specifically of the rich collapsed. Poor people's spending barely fell at all. But the spending of the rich collapsed, which meant that anybody who worked in the luxury non-essential sector lost their incomes, and the government stood in to fill the gap. So essentially, systemically, what happened during COVID was an expenditure of the rich got replaced by an expenditure of the government, which meant that the government printed largely and pumped money in. That went to ordinary workers. They use that to pay their bills, their rent, their mortgage. That goes to the owners of the assets who are the rich. And the rich simply, it was basically illegal for them to spend that money. So what it meant was that the rich accumulated that money. And this was so systemically obvious at the beginning of COVID. And so unbelievably little analysed. I think it's the most fantastic indictment of the state of economics today. That in the last 3 years, the government of this country has given out 7 billion. And I looked at the US number and I think it was 3 trillion, right? That governments can give out trillions of pounds and nobody even asks the question of who is going to accumulate that money. And you know, we'll probably do a video on this at some point, but what that comes down to is there is a terrible, woeful lack of analysis of distribution in economics. So that no one even asked the question, basically. But, you know, the government gave out £14,000 per adult. Somebody had to have it. If you do the analysis, which I've just gone through, it's quite obvious that that money will end up with the richest because that money has gone in basically as a subsidy for the collapsed spending of the rich. So it was unbelievably obvious at the beginning of COVID that what we would see is the biggest and fastest increase in inequality in the history of the country. And if you have an unbelievably rapid increase in inequality during a period of time when the economy is literally closed, it is really obvious that on reopen, what you will see is a massive increase in quality of life of the rich and a massive decrease of quality of life in the poor. What else could you possibly expect if you've increased inequality enormously in a period when the economy was closed? And I don't know if you remember, but the media reporting during COVID was just about the stupidest thing you have ever heard, right? They were like, everybody's accumulating so much money, we're going to have a roaring 20s. You know, you don't create roaring 20s just by giving money out, right? If you give a huge amount of money specifically to the rich, what you create is a cost of living crisis. And this brings us to the next point of the video, okay? So we're concluding now how the money ends up with the richest. Hopefully it's clear. If anybody wants to understand more, go back and watch the very first video on this channel. We'll put a link in the description. It's called How the Rich Got Rich from COVID-19. But the next question, I think this is a really interesting discussion, is how does it affect you and how does it affect the economy? So there's lots and lots of ways in which wealth inequality can increase in a society. The most obvious way is that ordinary families lose their assets and those assets start to be owned by richer families. The direct transfer of assets from the middle class to the rich. And that's happening. You know, you can see that tends to happen generationally. So what you see is middle class families, the older generation own property, the younger generation cannot afford to own property. Those properties end up being owned by the younger generations of richer families. So generationally, assets are being transferred from the middle class to the rich. That's one way inequality can increase. Another way wealth inequality can increase is debt. A big increase in debt from the middle class to the rich. And we're seeing that as well in the massive increase in size of mortgages and also massive increase in size of government debt, okay? That's another way that inequality can increase. And I think both of those, if you do them slowly enough, people don't recognize, right? Like generationally, the older generation doesn't realize their kids are losing property. Younger people are kind of realizing it, I think. The increase in debt, it happens slowly. People don't really notice it that much. But people don't like it. People don't like having a lot of debt and people don't like losing their assets. But what happened during COVID was a massive increase in inequality without taking your assets and without putting you into debt. And what that was just printing a crap ton of money and giving it to the rich. Does that hurt you? And how does it hurt you? You know, I think it's really worth just sitting and asking yourself the question. And, you know, people watching, you might even want to pause the video and ask yourself the question, what do I think would happen? Let's assume that money went to the top 10%. So you give the richest 5 million adults in the country each 140 grand cash. What do you think would happen? Stop for a minute and think, what would happen if the government gave the richest 5 million adults in the country each 140 grand cash? Well, the first thing is they're going to buy assets. So you're going to see assets go up because rich people tend to prefer to buy assets. But they already own assets, right? So they're just buying assets from each other. There will be some net transfer of assets from the middle class to the rich. So some assets will go up. But they can't buy enough assets because they've been given so much money. So asset prices go up, then they feel even richer, and then they start increasing their spending, right? They start increasing their spending. That pushes up the prices of everything. You know, one of the big reasons why food became more expensive, even before the Ukraine war, was because the cost of shipping became more expensive. Because the rich were buying so much stuff that it was filling up the shipping containers. You know, ultimately, these guys, they spend more money, it pushes the price of stuff up. And people sometimes turn around to me and say, oh, but you say the rich have they prefer to save, which is true. It's true, the rich prefer to save, but they don't save everything. If you give 5 million people 140 grand each, you're going to push the prices of stuff up. It's such an enormous amount of money. Such an enormous amount of money. And I think it's interesting because it's a really interesting way to make people poorer, is to print money and give it to the rich. Because you don't even see it happening, right? You know, it happens behind closed doors, you know. And in fact, what most people think is the government were really good, they gave money to furloughed workers. You know, but if you actually ask the question of who ended up with the money, then what you see is a massive, massive transfer of cash to the rich. And what I think is quite interesting, if you were to ask an economist that question 5 years ago, before COVID, what do you think would happen if you gave the richest 5 million adults in the country 140 grand each? They would all say to you, inflation crisis. They would all say that to you. They would all say that to you. And yet what happened was, we did that, we immediately had an inflation crisis, and everybody says, well, because of the war in Ukraine. And, you know, you will remember, it was, you know, when this channel was, the invasion of Ukraine was when this channel was much smaller. And I called you up and I was like, this is going to be a fucking disaster. You know, of course, the war itself is a disaster, right? But looking at it just purely from the perspective of Western economies, the British economy, I said, what this will do is it will take entirely the blame for the inflationary crisis. They will blame it all on Ukraine. And people don't remember, but the inflationary crisis started before the invasion of Ukraine, right? And it was always inevitably going to happen, in my opinion. But as soon as that will happen, I was like, I cannot tell you what a disaster this is for our economy and for the future of our society. And I don't at all want to undermine what's happened to the people of Ukraine. That is, of course, a disaster, right? But I am a British economist. My job is to analyse the UK economy. As soon as that happened, it was a disaster for Western European economies and the American economy. Because if that hadn't have happened, we would still have seen a massive inflationary crisis. And it would have been very difficult to blame on anything other than this massive accumulation of cash of the rich during COVID. But as soon as that war happens, you have a very easy scapegoat. It's because of the war. It's because of the war. And it means that what has happened is the biggest ever transfer in wealth from the government to the richest people in the world, in the history of the world, followed by the most obvious consequences you would have predicted: an increase in inequality, an increase in asset prices, an increase in cost of living, a decrease in quality of life for ordinary people. And no one is even talking about the accumulation of cash by the rich. It is coming in a little bit, you know, and we try to raise that up the profile as much as we can. But, you know, I would really encourage anybody watching this video now, if you haven't seen it, go back and watch the first video on this channel. Came out in June 2020, right? Before the inflation crisis, before any of this, it was in the middle of lockdown. And I said, what you will see is massive increase in inequality, massive increase in inflation, massive increase in asset prices, and ordinary people will be thrown into poverty and probably austerity. All of those things have happened, okay? And it's, you know, the reason I was right then is the same reason I've been right for fucking 50 years, because I understand that the distribution is important to the economy, which is something that most economists miss. And, you know, if you massively increase inequality when the economy is closed, how can you expect not to cause a decrease in living standards? Where has the increase in wealth of the rich come from, if not from poverty for the rest? You know, if they become richer, they will take a larger share of the resources, you know, and I think we'll do another video on why economists, mainstream economists, miss this so much, because it breaks my heart, the pathetic idiocy we see from economists so much. But the truth is, they're rich, they're from rich families, they're from rich backgrounds, they're getting paid, they don't give a shit, right? People need to be aware that inequality has increased massively in the last 3 years, and that when inequality increases, broad living standards fall. Not only that, but it creates a spiral effect, because the end result is ordinary families will sell their assets. to support themselves, which means they get poorer still, which means wealth inequality gets bigger still, you know. Another video which people should watch, if they're here watching now, is the Flows of Wealth video, which makes it clear, once inequality gets big, it starts to spiral out of control. So the end message here is, number one, that money went to the rich. Number two, if you give the rich a ton of money, it creates inflation and makes ordinary people poorer. Number three, that creates increased flows of wealth from the middle class to the rich, which makes the situation worse still. So, you know, really, this is a dire emergency situation. I can't put any finer a point of it on that. But unfortunately, most economists from rich families, from rich backgrounds, getting well paid, studied for many years, not looking at inequality at all. They will not fix this. They will not fix this. Honestly, they will not fix this. And, you know, the reason I made this channel is because I am very aware, if nothing is done about this, the economy will collapse very seriously in the coming years. So this is why I go on and on about £700 billion, you know, and it will be 800 and it will be 900, and I will keep the viewers informed with what it is. But something has to be done. But I think using this number is a great opportunity, I've spoken about on the channel, to attack the government, and not just in this country. In the US, I think it's 3 trillion. I'll put the exact US number in the description because I know we do have some viewers in the US. Ask them where the money is now, because they cannot answer that question. They cannot answer that question. And if they did answer that question, then it would be unbelievably, painfully obvious what we have to do to fix this crisis. If we were to tax back the rich, just enough to make them as rich as they were 3 years ago, we would have enough to give every single adult in this entire country £14,000 each. And this crisis would be over. So go at them, you know. Write to your MP, call into the radio station, go on the news, put it on your Facebook, tell your friends and family. Follow us on everything, TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, of course YouTube. Share these videos, and let's get something done about it, man, because if nothing is done, things get worse and worse. But we can make change if we're willing to hold these guys to account. These rich fuckers. Money currently is flowing from the government